Hi guys, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, settle in, pull that blanket up around your chin, tilt your head back on that nice plump pillow, and press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. We're about to wander into a world of frost, fire, and regal toes in trouble. You know, when people think of medieval kings, they picture broadswords, banquets, and those long velvet coats that brush the floor like an overtired page boy. But not often do we think of something far more urgent, something so primal that even kings couldn't decree it away: the cold. Winter in a medieval castle was less winter wonderland and more stone icebox with decorative murder holes. Castles weren't built for comfort. They were built to stop a horde of invaders from storming in and absconding with the family shield collection. This meant thick stone walls, high ceilings, and more drafty corridors than a grandmother's attic. Central heating, regrettably, had not yet been invented, not unless you count the occasional festive peasant holding a torch. So how did kings stay warm? Let's set the scene. It's the year 1292. King Alaric the Wearily Wrapped has retreated to his great hall at Dunlow Keep. The fire in the hearth crackles valiantly, though it's fighting a losing battle against the sheer Arctic hug of the surrounding stones. Icicles dangle from the arrow loops. The royal cat, a hefty marmalade beast named Toulouse, has taken up residence directly atop the only warm brick in the room. King Alaric isn't alone. He's got a retinue of chilled nobles, a jester who jokes mostly through chattering teeth, and a squadron of servants whose primary duty in winter months is not surprisingly to serve. No. Their job is to shoo away cold with hot spiced wine and portable braziers that smoke more than they heat. Ah yes, braziers. Not the ones your mind just jumped to. These were portable metal pans filled with glowing coals, carried about the castle like medieval space heaters with a penchant for singed robes and unexpected foot burns. Practical, debatable, fashionable, only if you enjoyed the scent of mild smoke and unintentional arson. Furs, of course, were everywhere. Kings wore robes lined in ermine, a fancy way to say tiny snow weasels with excellent pelts. The richer you were, the more fur you had. Some lords wore so many layers, they waddled rather than walked, transforming courts into a slow-moving parade of cuddly authority. At night, the royal bed became an engineering marvel. The king's four-poster bed was not just a place for royal repose. It was a carefully curated fortress against the cold. Thick mattresses stuffed with straw or, if you were extremely lucky, feathers. Heavy woolen blankets. Canopies with thick drapery to trap. Warm air and muffle one's snores. Sometimes even a warming pan. A long-handled metal dish filled with coals was briefly passed between the sheets before bedtime, right before the fire hazard teams gave a silent prayer and walked away. Then there were the bedfellows, not the scandalous kind, although history does tell tales. We're talking about servants, children, sometimes even very confused dogs, tucked in together, not for mischief, but for sheer warmth. It was considered completely ordinary for the royalty, or at least their tired lady-in-waiting, to snuggle up beside someone who smelled slightly like roasted turnips and court anxiety. And yet, despite all these efforts, castles remained cold, breathtakingly, toe-numbingly, bone-chatteringly cold. One bishop once described February in his manner as God's way of saying, "Not today, Jeff." So kings resorted to the only truly undefeated weapon against winter: delegation. They held court under heated cloaks. They summoned soup. They demanded mulled ale. And when none of it quite worked, they did as many of us still do today. They grumbled about the weather, declared it an abomination, and returned to bed. Some even took wintering in a sunnier duchy as the medieval version of working remotely. Because if you have a kingdom and a crown, why not travel south when the castle starts resembling an upscale meat locker? So the next time you're sliding into fresh sheets, with the thermostat set to toasty, and your only concern is whether your tea's steeped perfectly, remember King Alaric, wrapped like a human footstool in 14 layers of velvet, using a brazier as both foot warmer and extremely inefficient pet. The icicles outside his hall might have chilled a troubadour mid-ballad. But within that chilly fortress, the fire hissed, the wine simmered, and somewhere beneath a mountain of blankets, the crown slept soundly, just hopefully not too close to the warming pan. And now, as the castle begins to slumber under its blanket of snow and low torchlight, let's quietly follow the braided scent of cinnamon and ash toward the next tender hallway of time. Now, before we throw on a fur cloak and trudge down the icy corridors of medieval interior design, it's important you understand the fundamental truth of castle life in winter. It was absolutely freezing. Not, ooh, I forgot to put socks on, chilly. This was, your breath hangs in the air like a ghost that hasn't paid rent. Cold. Stone castles, as magnificent and mighty as they appeared in paintings and dramatic reenactments, were not built for comfort. They were defensive fortresses, meant to keep out arrow-slinging invaders, rebellious peasants, and the occasional disgruntled cousin with a questionable claim to the throne. Thermal insulation, alas, came much later in human ambition. Luckily for medieval kings, where there's a royal will, there's an equally royal workaround. And so, in we go, past the heavy wooden gate, across the frosty cobbles of the bailey, and through the great arched doors of the keep, into the peculiar, toasty secrets of medieval warmth. First up on our list of noble heat hacks, the fireplace. The medieval hearth wasn't just a cozy backdrop for brooding soliloquies and suspicious royal announcements. It was the very heart of winter survival. Great halls often had enormous fireplaces along one or more walls, sometimes so wide you could roast half a deer without displacing the royal poker. But make no mistake, they were glorified smoke funnels. Chimneys, as we know them, were rare until later in the medieval period. Early on, smoke from fires simply roamed the ceiling like an awkward ghost, slowly escaping through a hole in the roof. So yes, the heat was delicious, if you didn't mind also inhaling your dinner as a vapor. Despite their grandeur, fireplaces were a bit like medieval Wi-Fi, pleasant when working, but rarely in the room you needed it most. Bedchambers were often left cold unless you were wealthy enough, or cranky enough, to demand a smaller hearth be installed in your sleeping quarters. Kings, naturally, were both. But even the most emboldened fire can only do so much when stone walls suck heat like a greedy troll hoarding gold. So the smartly shivering royalty adapted. Enter the hangings. No, not the execution-y kind. These were thick woven tapestries that adorned castle walls, not merely to show off one's heroic lineage or suspicious number of lions on a shield, but to act as a primitive form of insulation. Think of your walls getting into bed with a commemorative quilt of battle scenes and dramatic rearing horses. Tapestries trapped warm air, blocked drafts, and made even the dreariest granite nursery feel something approaching cozy. Next came the curious hierarchy of beds. The medieval royal bed was not simply a mattress on stilts. It was a four-poster stage for all-night duvet drama. Thick curtains would be drawn around all sides to keep in body heat, creating a miniature microclimate. Picture a royal cocoon, complete with furs, woolen sheets, and sometimes a hot brick wrapped in cloth, slipped in beneath the covers, a medieval precursor to the hot water bottle, but with a bit more risk of burning your foot or inviting chimney soot into bed. Of course, there were also braziers, portable metal baskets of coals that glowed like medieval space heaters. These little warmth miracles could be carried from room to room, placing one uncomfortably close to the royal knee or underneath the throne. A bit smoky naturally, and with occasional sparks that made everyone suck in their breath during important state dinners, but undoubtedly better than freezing through your fifth diplomatic negotiation with the Duke of somewhere important. Fashion too played its essential part. Cloaks lined with ermine, tunics layered like lasagna, and hats, endless, eccentric, tower-defying hats that looked like someone had made a windmill out of velvet and declared it high couture. But they were warm, and when you're ruling a realm where your breath turns into icicles mid-sentence, dignity becomes negotiable. We must, as ever, admire the royals' resilience and their ability to pretend none of this was a bother. Sitting on a throne wrapped in 3 layers of goose feather padding under a fur-lined cape, in a room woven like a wool museum, our king would nod serenely to visiting noblemen as if this were the most natural way to digest pheasant. And speaking of pheasant, there's more to say about how food, steaming, simmering, sizzling, became an unlikely ally in the war against the cold. For what better way to beat the chill than with a steaming bowl of questionable medieval stew? But that, dear listener, is something we'll stir gently in the next breathy turn of the tale. Back in the gloom of a frosty medieval morning, when your only alarm clock was a rooster with no snooze button, and your windows were essentially high-grade holes in the wall, being a king wasn't exactly cozy business. You see, temperature control in the year 1287 was a bit of a DIY situation. There was no thermostatic dial to whirl, no electric blanket to burrito oneself into, and certainly no steaming mug of chamomile nestled in royal hands. Not unless chamomile was code for mulled wine. Which, honestly, it often was. So how, you may wonder, did a king avoid turning into a royal popsicle in his castle? Well, dear listener, let us tiptoe quietly into the chilly stone halls, lined with faded tapestries and questionable architectural decisions. Let's begin with the fireplaces, the medieval castle's answer to central heating, though central is a generous word, given that the warmth rarely made it beyond 6 feet from the hearth. These fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox, or, in desperate times, warm a noble's extremely cold toes. But they didn't exactly do a great job of distributing heat evenly. You were either sweating one eyebrow off, or shivering where your shadow started. Still, fireplaces were an advancement. Earlier castles had no chimneys. Smoke just sort of wafted about until it filtered out through the roof, or was absorbed permanently into everyone's clothing, hair, and general worldview. By the high Middle Ages, though, chimneys had started sprouting upward like very sooty trees, allowing for actual fireplaces to be nestled into the walls of great halls and royal chambers. Now, picture a medieval king sitting beside such a fire. He'd be draped in a fur-lined robe, possibly ermine, which is an adorable-sounding animal chosen specifically for its unfortunate habit of being warm and fashionable. The king would likely be wrapped up like a child in a blanket fort, layers upon layers making him increasingly more spherical and less mobile by the hour. Underneath it all, Wool. So much wool. If you could, knit it, wrap it, or vaguely drape it around your limbs to trap a sliver of body heat. It became part of the medieval winter wardrobe. Royal beds themselves were less furniture and more small, fortified strongholds. The great four-poster bed, far from being just decorative, was a tactical winter necessity. Heavy curtains, sometimes velvet, sometimes wool, always harboring mysterious crumbs from midnight snacks, were drawn tight at night to seal in both warmth and secrets. Hot stones, heated in the fire and wrapped in flannel cloth, would be slipped tenderly under the covers like primitive hot water bottles, missing only the mild burn warnings and cute penguin covers we know today. And while we're constructing a nighttime picture, forgive the interruption, but yes, there was snoring. Loud, regal snoring, echoing off stone walls. Imagine the sound of a walrus trapped in a beer barrel. That's closer to authenticity than poetry, I'm afraid. Some castles attempted more ambitious heating methods. The hypocaust system, stolen lovingly from the Romans, involved channeling heat from a furnace beneath the floor. This invention was rare outside monastic and noble settings, and even then, the results were inconsistent and often ruined by well-meaning servants accidentally extinguishing the fire or sitting too close and catching historical fire themselves. The king also didn't warm himself alone. He had the ultimate medieval life hack: people, servants, courtiers, jesters, the odd uncle who refused to leave. Crowds generated body heat. A bustling great hall of a feast, especially when packed with bodies, flame-lit torches, and what can only be described as meaty optimism, could raise the indoor temperature from cold tomb to light permafrost. Progress was progress, for warmth and style. A monarch might also commission extensive wall hangings and carpets, not because he fancied Renaissance interior design before it was cool, but because stone walls are freezing. Tapestries covering the walls served a purpose beyond storytelling. They trapped heat, muffled echoes, and made the place look a smidge less like a glorified barn. The great castles were, in their way, giant patchwork quilts of wealth, shivering ambition, and hardy textile innovation. So while kings may have had lords, lands, and laws bending to their will, the winter wind answered to no man. It hissed through arrow slits, whistled down chimneys, and nibbled at royal toes despite the fur, the fires, and the formidable layers of wool wrapped around their nocturnal dignity. But somewhere inside all that stone and tapestry, as the fire crackled low and the wind howled like a ghost with indigestion, a king could curl beneath his mountain of covers and, for a moment, forget that his castle was basically a cavern with embroidery. And speaking of survival strategies, it turns out the royal wardrobe played a much bigger role than one might think. Now, let us slip quietly beyond the drafty stone walls and into an institution both ancient and critically important for medieval winter survival: the royal bed. Not just any bed, mind you. The royal bed was less a place to rest one's crown and more a small, strategically engineered fortress. Less sleep number, more sleep bunker. You see, in an era before thermostats, electric blankets, or that sock-wearing teddy bear who pitches duvets on television, the medieval bedroom was often the coldest room in the entire castle. Logically bizarre, yes, but architecturally, oh so consistent. Great halls had fireplaces large enough to roast a wild boar and maybe his extended family. But bedrooms had drafts that could qualify for the Olympics. Enter the great bed. A medieval monarch's bed was not simply a piece of furniture, but a lifestyle. These were massive looming wooden constructions carved and creaked into existence by carpenters with very cold hands. 4 posts rose like tree trunks at each corner, and a heavy canopy loomed above, sometimes of wood, sometimes heavy fabric, designed not for elegance but insulation. Yes, this bed had a roof, because the ceiling above you was possibly leaking or possibly infested with surly bats, but most definitely not holding in any heat. Around the bed, curtains. Thick, swooping velvet or wool, if your castle's budget was less royal and more duke with debt. These curtains could be drawn closed all the way around, transforming the bed into a miniature room within a room. Once inside, the royal sleeper would be protected from the rude chill nipping at their nose and the moths who'd learned to wear tiny scarves. Now, blanket technology had not quite discovered the concept of light and breathable. At the time, a good night's sleep involved being pinned beneath a stratified stack of bedclothes heavy enough to discourage any movement whatsoever. The bottom layer was a sturdy linen sheet, slightly softer than canvas sailcloth. Then came the wool blankets, thick as a sheep's opinion of winter. On especially cold nights, furs would be added, bear, wolf, or if you were in truly ostentatious circles, ermine. Nothing says sweet dreams like reposing under the coats of a dozen small carnivores. But the crown jewel in bedtime heating, the bedfellow. No, please, don't raise an eyebrow at me. In medieval times, humans were straight-up heat sources. Royalty often slept with their spouses out of both affection and conservation of warmth. Even less romantically, some kings invited pet dogs, courtiers, or even favoured chamberlains if things got desperate enough, and no one had invented the phrase personal space. Remember, medieval winters were not picky about propriety, and yet sometimes all the piles of fur and human company still weren't enough. Enter the humble yet heroic bed warmer. This curious contraption looked like a frying pan with trust issues. You'd take a brass or pewter pan, fill it with glowing coals from the fire, yes, actual fire, and then slide it beneath the sheets just before bed, gently, ideally. Accident-prone chambermaids sometimes forgot the gentle part. A hot pan on a cold mattress can produce results that are memorable, but not medically advisable. For the particularly pampered, there were even warming stones, smooth, flat rocks heated in the hearth and wrapped in cloth, tucked between the covers like prehistoric hot water bottles. The trick was remembering where you'd put them before jumping into bed with too much enthusiasm and an underdeveloped sense of danger. Of course, there were side effects to all this cocooning. The air behind the bed curtains grew thick and humid from breath, creating a microclimate all its own. Some kings awoke warm but damp, like forgotten laundry, but they were at least alive and frostbite-free, which in medieval December was nothing short of a miracle. And so, the royal bed stood as the last bastion of heat, offering a womb-like retreat from the stone-chiseled chill of the castle beyond. Within its curtained embrace, our kings and queens would drift to sleep, possibly under 3 people, 2 dogs, and a heated rock. But how did they warm their bones before they even climbed into bed? Ah, that story lies in the flickering, smoky heart of the castle, a place of clanking pots and boiling goose fat, where warmth was born every morning from wood, fire, and a healthy disregard for smoke alarms. Let's wander down there, quietly. Of all the people to suffer the indignity of a medieval winter, few were as melodramatically inconvenienced as the royal chamberlain. You see, long before central heating and fleece-lined pajama onesies, a castle's warmth wasn't simply a luxury. It was a desperate chess match against icy drafts, collapsing tapestries, and firewood that never seemed dry enough. It was the Chamberlain's eternal duty to make sure his or her royal freezingness didn't, heaven forbid, have to awaken and bark, "Why is there frost on my crown?" So let us drift, featherlight and sleepy, through one of 1,000 chilly dawns in the year 1278, somewhere in the northern reaches of what is now France, but was then merely too far from the coast to matter and too close to the Alps to ignore. The castle is dewdrop grey, nestled on a hill like a particularly disgruntled stone toad. Inside its thick walls lives King Philippe, though lives is a generous term. He mostly reclines, occasionally rides his horse, and otherwise exists beneath no fewer than 5 fur cloaks at any given moment. Now, before the sun even grazes the frosted battlements, the Chamberlain, a gentleman known only as Sir Godric the Grumbler, rises from a bed that is less a bed and more a hay-stuffed box with regrets. He stumbles into boots shaped like boiled turnips and begins the arduous process of warming the king's suite. Sir Godric's weapons in this daily war against frostbite were noble, if slightly pitiful. First came the brazier, a fire-filled pot of glowing coals, wheeled in from the kitchens like a slow-burning turtle. Lit an hour before dawn, it was dragged by a coughing servant through stone corridors that had not known warmth since, possibly, the Romans. Then came the bed inspection. Oh yes, meditative and tender, like a shepherd seeing to newborn lambs. The royal bed consisted of a large trestle frame, upon which lay a feather mattress, 4 goatskin sheets, an embroidered woolen blanket, and what must have amounted to half the kingdom's squirrel population, now resigned to life as a duvet. Heating a royal bed was an art in itself, and involved something called a bed warmer. But don't let the name deceive you. It wasn't some enchanted device blessed by woodland spirits. It was, in truth, a copper pan filled with hot coals, scuttled beneath the sheets like a crab in a bonnet. It was also the cause of no fewer than 16 recorded castle fires in the preceding decade. Warm feet came, one could say, at a cost. If coal wasn't available, say the wagons were late or had been hijacked by enthusiastic peasants who insisted warmth wasn't just for nobility. Dried peat was used instead. Yes, dried dirt. Dirt that smoked like a disgruntled sorcerer when burned, and made everything it touched smell faintly of betrayal and moss. Despite these scented indignities, King Philippe demanded that his chamber reach a temperature suitable for plotting, which courtly scholars believed hovered somewhere around not completely unbearable. Let us not forget the tapestries. The medieval wallpaper of choice. These weren't just for showing off your great-great-uncle's dramatic death by goose in the Battle of Spoonsworth. They were insulation, thick woolen barriers that stopped the wind from howling quite so loudly through those cheerfully unsealed stone cracks. And the windows. Oh, the windows. Clear glass was rare and expensive. Thus, most royal windows found themselves covered with oiled parchment. This did the job of keeping out the worst of the breeze, while still letting in what little sun existed between November and March. Occasionally, a piece would flutter loose, leaving noble guests to suffer the indignity of draught face, an affliction well documented in court poetry as "Ye coal sneer, what stays till noon." But perhaps the king's most underrated source of warmth, bizarrely beloved, rarely discussed, were his royal dogs. These weren't mere pets. They were living, snoring hot water bottles, spaniels on feet, sighthounds under elbows, a particularly flat-faced pug who slept near the king's armpit, much to the queen's dismay. There's even a letter, yellowed with age, where the royal scribe apologizes for forgetting to address the king's favourite hound, Sir Puffington the Mild. He was reportedly a very enthusiastic cuddler, so by the time the sun peeked over frost-covered hills, the chamber was more or less inhabitable. The brazier glowed, the bed was toasty, the dogs were positioned, the chamberlain, now only mildly frostbitten himself, bowed low as King Philippe emerged from the covers like a disgruntled bear awakened too early from hibernation. "Send for the leg warmers," he croaked. And so, the battle for warmth began anew. But while kings and their chamberlains were busy unlocking the ancient mysteries of heating a room by sheer willpower and flammable furniture, outside the castle, something else was stirring. Something humbler, smoky, and yet somehow much, much toastier. Beyond the heavy oaken doors and through winding stone halls slick with centuries of chill, there was a room in many medieval castles that glowed with a peculiar flickering promise, the solar. Not to be confused with a giant orb of burning gas in the sky, which, let's be honest, was doing absolutely nothing useful during a 14th century English February. The solar was the medieval noble's answer to, how do I not freeze to death in my own home? Tucked high above the drafty bustle of the great hall, the solar was the private family chamber of the lord or lady of the castle. Think of it as a medieval version of a cosy upstairs reading nook, only with more stone, less insulation, and a greater risk of stepping on a wayward tapestry nail. The solar was positioned to catch what little sunlight dared pierce the clouds, typically facing south, and enjoyment of said sunlight was accompanied by a roaring fire in a corner hearth. Because, as it turns out, watery English sunbeams weren't exactly famous for their life-saving thermal properties. But oh, the effort it took to have that fire. First, someone, most likely a youth named something like Godric or Wilbert, had to trek early in the morning to the lower court, slip-slide through the icy mud, collect firewood, or what passed for it, avoid stepping on the cook's disgruntled goose, and return without dropping an entire armload of kindling into the moat. Back in the solar, the firewood would be fed into a hearth lined with thick stone, and the whole place would begin to feel just slightly less like a meat locker. Add to that thick woolen tapestries on the walls depicting knights, saints, dragons, or perhaps a very serious falcon, and you had the makings of a medieval heat trap. These cloth murals weren't just art, they were insulation with a story to tell. Of course, the realities of medieval firemaking meant the solar often smelled of a gentle, smoky perfume, an aromatic blend of bark, ash, and the faint, unspoken hope that the chimney wasn't blocked. Every so often, a scullion would be summoned to sweep out the soot with a bundled broom and a prayer to St. Florian, patron saint of chimney sweeps and people doomed to sneeze forever. Now, while the solar was the medieval version of central heating, albeit with deeply local reach, i.e. only available in the room you were physically inside, the nobility didn't stop there in their pursuit of bedtime warmth. Windows, for instance, were ingeniously and occasionally covered in thin slices of horn or waxed linen, medieval alternatives to glass that kept out the wind while giving your room the ambience of a permanently steamed-up spectacles factory. To cozy up even further, nobles would pile layer upon layer of textiles inside the solar. Thick rugs, often coloured deep woad blue or madder red, were strewn across the cold flagstone floors. Stools and benches wore little cushions like hats. Even the beds themselves had curtains, properly known as bed hangings, not just for drama or preventing the dog from jumping on your feet in the night, but as an actual barrier against the cold night air and whatever ghost was currently haunting the wardrobe. And then, of course, there was the cloaking technique, the medieval burrito method. The noble would retire to their great wooden bed, which was really more of an indoor fort, and be carefully tucked in beneath furs, woolen coverlets, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a feather-filled mattress so soft it felt like sleeping in a disgruntled goose, possibly the same one from earlier. It was in the solar, warm from firelight and rustling with the crinkle of too many layers of fabric, that the medieval lord or lady would perhaps write letters, enjoy music from a passing harpist, or squint at a manuscript in the gentlest, gloomiest light imaginable. Think cozy cottagecore, but with more gout. So while the great hall was echoing with the clatter of trenchers and the occasional dog snoring beneath the trestle table, and while the castle kitchens were bubbling with pots larger than a small child, the solar remained a treasured retreat, a place of warmth, closeness, and the subtle thrill of not immediately dying from ceiling icicles. And tomorrow, well, that's the thing about heat in a stone chamber. You chase it like a fox hunt, and every morning the quarry gets away. But in the meantime, the fire is crackling softly, the tapestries dull the wind's howl, and the stiff bedclothes sit like a protective husk. For tonight at least, all is snug. Elsewhere though, in the hidden arteries of the castle, another lesser-known method of medieval thermal mischief was unfolding. One involving not firewood, but the slow, laborious sway of hot air, and the often overlooked genius of passive, smoky ingenuity. Of all the peculiar and poetic ways medieval monarchs tried to keep warm, few were as enduringly strange, or strangely endearing, as their fascination with heated bricks. Yes, before there were radiators, electric blankets, or the noble microwavable wheat bag, there was the humble brick, baked, roasted like a turnip in the hearth until it sizzled faintly and glowed with ambition, then wrapped in cloth like a baby swaddled in medieval elegance. These toasty objects were nestled beneath feet or slid like glowing tortoises under royal bed covers. A monarch might even instruct a servant, possibly the youngest, least lucky page boy, to place one at the foot of the throne, thereby gently sautéing the royal toes, while the business of ruling slouched drearily on. The bricks weren't alone in their mission. They were joined by foot warmers, wooden boxes filled with embers, carried about like smouldering handbags of minor nobility. Peasants might use them in church, slipping them beneath their benches and praying their woolen socks wouldn't melt. But royalty? Royalty made it fashion. These ember boxes were sometimes daintily carved, gilded, and perfumed. Imagine the ballerina of burning boxes, twirling below a fur-lined gown. Now, for the castle itself, as we've established, these stone behemoths were reluctant to cooperate when it came to warmth. They held onto cold the way a miser holds onto gold, clinging, greedy, and entirely unhelpful. So the kings had to fight back not just with fire, but with layers, rooms within rooms, and a smattering of science. Well, science, as it was defined when people also believed bad smells could cause plague. One royal architectural trick of keeping warm was to gather important meetings in smaller chambers. The massive Great Hall, with its echoing ceiling and drafty tapestries, was majestic, yes, but also roughly the temperature of a glacier's armpit. So during the colder months, kings retreated to something called a solar, not the celestial body, but a private, upper-floor sitting room that hoarded heat better than others. The solar had smaller windows, low ceilings, and, most crucially, a fireplace that never stopped feasting on wood. Speaking of fireplaces, let's talk about chimneys, or rather, their lack of existence for much of the early medieval period. For centuries, smoke drifted lazily through a hole in the roof, mingling with rafters and resident bats before making its eventual exit. When chimneys became more common in the later Middle Ages, it was an architectural game changer. Finally, fireplaces could be embedded into walls, more efficient at heating a specific room, instead of just blessing the ceiling with carbon perfume. But the real magic, the spell knitted together by necessity, was the dance of bodies. Nothing warms a room as effectively as bodies, servants bustling, nobles gossiping, jesters spinning and flailing about in what can only be described as medieval interpretive dance. In winter, the court would pack more tightly, layering people like tapestries. Each body gave off heat, and collectively, they brewed a stew of shared warmth, awkward proximity, and occasionally alarmingly strong perfumes. And yet, in spite of brick-warmed beds, ember boxes, roaring fireplaces, and massed humanity, sometimes nothing helped. Not even the bare fur cloaks or the woolen underthings that grew more numerous with each icy week. On nights when drafts howled like ghosts with midlife crises, even kings gave up. They pulled their thickest coverlets, their dogskin mittens, yes, an actual thing, and their favorite hounds across the bed, and resigned themselves to the art of strategic shivering. Ah, yes, the dogs, not just noble companions for hunting and growling at peasants, but personal heating units. A medieval king might be flanked in sleep by 2 or 3 large greyhounds. There was even a nickname for them, bed dogs. You see, practical royalty didn't care if it was undignified. They knew what the peasants had long understood. A dog snoozing at your feet is worth 3 fur coats and an extra fireplace. So as the castle wine shrieked through the arrow slits and the snow fell thick as pastry on the courtyards below, the king lay wrapped in layers of wool, fur, indignity, and at least one slightly flatulent hound, dreaming not of power or glory, but possibly of summer. The fire crackled softly, the heated brick cooled gently under the blankets, and the monarch, enveloped in warmth both real and improvised, drifted into slumber. But what of those who served him, who fanned the flame, fluffed the furs, and fetched those fictional bricks of comfort? Let's slip quietly down the servants' staircase and peek in on their cozy conspiracies. The great halls of medieval castles, those stone-clad fortresses of royal splendor, were not, as one might optimistically imagine, warm cocoons of roaring firelight and toasty banquets. No, they were more like elegant barns with some flair, vast, echoing, and stubbornly committed to staying about 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding tundra outside, which was impressive really, considering all the architectural effort that somehow went into preserving cold rather than eliminating it. You see, stone retains temperature. Unfortunately, in winter, it retains the temperature of sadness. Kings, however, being kings, were not about to accept a life of frostbitten toes and chattering monarchy. Solutions were pursued, sometimes ingenious, sometimes, well, let's call them innovative in spirit, if not in effect. Take the royal fireplace. It was never just a charming wall accessory for romantic glances and subtle political threats. It was instead a roaring necessity. The grand hearths of castles were taller than most peasants and wide enough to roast a prize boar, or a diplomatic rival, depending on the political climate. These fireplaces were carefully built into thick outer walls, drawing smoke away through increasingly sophisticated chimney systems. early chimneys were not common until the 12th century. So before that, the smoke had to muscle its way out through a hole in the roof, slowly blackening every wooden beam and noble lung along the way. So, yes, the fire kept you warm, but also gave you a charming, persistent cough and the complexion of smoked sausage. To further spread the precious warmth around, clever kings demanded tapestries, those enormous decorative woolen blankets for the walls. Besides telling glorious tales of battles, probably exaggerated by 10 to 15 dragons, these wall hangings help trap warmth and blunt the harshness of cold moisture trickling down the stone walls. Think of it as wallpaper with delusions of grandeur. Now, one might wonder whether people sat huddled by these fires, clutching steaming mugs of something cozy, perhaps a medieval hot cocoa? Alas, no. Chocolate, though known to a few elite through bitter trade secrets, was not yet the cuddly confection we know today. Hot drinks tended to be wine boiled near death with spices, served slightly less scalding than the mood of the host. Meanwhile, the problem of heating one's royal posterior on the move led to the beloved and underappreciated foot warmer. Often a perforated box of metal or clay filled with embers and placed under the table during meals, it was a chance for noble toes to enjoy what we might describe as mid-temperature relief. Of course, if you kicked it or your servant was inattentive, there was a real possibility of setting the table linens and your Majesty's mood ablaze. More enterprising monarchs even used foot warmers in bed. But by bed, we must clarify, these weren't feather-soft oases of warmth. They were wooden frames, usually with ropes or leather straps laced across to form a sort of medieval mattress spring system, topped with whatever was available, straw, feathers, or occasionally a disgruntled goose still in the feathers. These were covered with thick coverings, furs, wool blankets, and in luckier cases, coverlets embroidered with enough gold thread to start a minor war. And yet, even under all these layers, cold had a way of sneaking in. The cold in a medieval castle was less a temperature and more a lifestyle. It mingled with your thoughts, chilled your ambitions, and sometimes prompted you to consider whether inventing central heating might move civilization along rather nicely. Alas, kings relied on their warming pans, a long-handled device filled with hot coals, swirled around beneath the sheets like a sleepy conductor summoning the orchestra of dreams. If used too eagerly or placed too near the bed curtains made of flammable desire, the warming pan could double as an impromptu alarm clock made of fire and regret. And then there was proximity. To people, that is. Royalty slept with courtiers and attendants often nearby, not out of affection, but because huddling together like medieval penguins was surprisingly effective. Even the gruffest baron became warmth compatible in February. Some monarchs, in colder corners of Europe, encouraged pets in bed not for cuteness, but out of necessity. A small brace of spaniels at the feet was just as much insulation as companionship. This may be the origin of the phrase three-dog night, a term suggesting just how many furry buddies were needed to ward off an enthusiastic frost. We drift, now, from echoing halls and flickering fires toward one of the castle's coziest oddities. For as kings strolled the icy corridors, favouring cloaks and capes, and even fur-lined crowns, they weren't alone in their quest for warmth. Their thrones themselves held a surprising secret, which, in the dim candlelight of history, we'll warm ourselves by next, as the frosty breath of winter deepened across the stone bones of the countryside. A new kind of night appeared in the great halls of medieval castles, not clad in chainmail, but in linen and wool, armed not with a sword, but with a poker and a practiced flick of the wrist. Nay, dear listener, these dauntless warriors were known simply as the Firekeepers. Ah yes, the Firekeeper, perhaps the most quietly powerful figure in the wintry hierarchy of the castle. These nighttime navigators of wood and ember held dominion over the one thing every king, queen and goose-feathered bed craved during the bitter months: heat. In tapestried halls where tempers could be as frosty as the walls, warmth was more valuable than wit. And while the stones whispered with cold and the windows boasted a permanent rime of frost lace, the Firekeeper patrolled with soft-soled boots and a bundle of kindling, like a monastic Santa Claus making rounds. The fireplaces themselves were marvels of medieval engineering and optimism. In the great hall, a fireplace might be wide enough to roast 12 boars and a minor noble all at once, though preferably not at the same time. These gaping mouths of stone were the beating hearts of the castle, and as midday meals turned into candlelit feasts, their flames would pop and crackle, casting heroic shadows on portraits that could only be described as ambitiously flattering. But for all the size of these hearths, they still had to fight uphill against bitter winds that slithered through gaps in the stone, weaving mischievously through tapestries and tugging at the hems of fur-lined cloaks. Speaking of tapestries, now there's a clever touch. While many take them as mere decoration or noble ego boosters, behold Sir Reginald defeating a dragon while also inventing the wheel. Tapestries were castle insulation with a flair for drama. They softened the echo, dulled the draught, and gave wandering eyes something to admire while they waited to regain feeling in their fingers. Within royal bedchambers, the fireplace was a smaller, more civilized affair, positioned beneath a carved mantle, often bearing the family crest or something vaguely intimidating, like a lion devouring a startled fish. It sputtered shyly, far too polite to emit sufficient heat. Thus, royalty relied not just on flames, but on fuel of a softer kind. Layers upon layers of bedding, some stuffed with down, others with straw, and the occasional surprise involving sheep's wool and mothballs. And, still, the most luxurious solution of all remained the ever-glorious bed warmer. Now, picture this: a round brass or pewter pan, attached to a long wooden handle. Into this fearsome device went hot coals, or in more cautious households, hot stones wrapped in flannel. The firekeeper, or a plucky servant with admirable trust in their prayer life, would slide it underneath the velvet covers and gently warm the sheets, one pass at a time. Very few experiences in life match the joy of sliding into a bed that's already been toasted like a loaf of monk-baked rye. But of course, this joy came with a side of danger, for overzealous warming could lead to smouldering mattresses, which led to hurried buckets of water and interesting notes in the court records. Then there was the undeniable social magic of warming oneself with others. In colder months, even princes became huggable. Castle dwellers huddled closer, sharing body heat like true medieval marsupials. The humble bench by the fire became a seat of diplomacy. Secrets were swapped, games of bones were played, and a kind of smoky camaraderie blossomed among unlikely allies. Ladies-in-waiting, squires, footmen, and the occasional cat, who refused to relinquish its prized spot on the hearthrug. But no warmth was more coveted, more elusive, than the elusive combination of three rare luxuries: a functioning fireplace, an intact bedfoot warmer, and a particularly fluffy dog named something like Sir Snuffles, who doubled as both foot warmer and light intruder deterrent. And so the nights passed, filled with muffled footsteps, whispered curses at stubborn flints, and the perpetual struggle between fire versus frost, wool versus wind, and monarch versus the almighty draft. But in this sprawling dance of stone and soot, someone was always watching the flame, quietly tending, softly stoking. And speaking of someone quietly tending, we've yet to explore the unsung champions of winter's war on cold, the castle laundresses, tasked with wrangling icy sheets and frozen undergarments. But let's not tumble into that chilly pile just yet. Warm your toes a moment longer, dear dreamer. While snowflakes dance delicately along the arrow slits of stone windows, and hoarfrost crept over the battlements like a sleepy ghost in a wool coat, the real question stirring beneath royal eyebrows was, yes, but where are my feet? Because being king in winter was less about ruling your realm and more about finding your toes. And in frozen fortresses, where the temperature hovered somewhere between cemetery at midnight and raw onion in the cellar, keeping warm became an art form worthy of knighthood. Which brings us rather elegantly to the great cloak conundrum of Edward II. Now Edward, son of the mighty Edward Longshanks, who you may recall from your early school days as that terrifying man from Braveheart, wasn't known for his martial prowess, but he could wrap a blanket around himself with such flair and stubbornness that it almost counted as military strategy. He once wore 4 cloaks at once during a particularly frosty January in 1316. We don't have direct evidence for this, but we do have a court record listing an alarming quantity of ermine trim, and one very annoyed laundress. Royal cloaks weren't just fashion, they were insulation. Woven of thick wool and often lined with fur that had met a chilly but noble end, cloaks kept the chill at bay by essentially burritoing the king inside a cozy, regal tortilla. And there's nothing like a tortilla of sable and velvet to keep the royal kneecaps from frosting over. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of wrapping themselves in entire rodent colonies. For lesser nobles and guests trying to survive January in a drafty hall, the king's generosity might extend to offering a shared brazier. A brazier, in case the word is floating fuzzily through your half-sleep, is basically a cautious and highly supervised bowl of fire. They were filled with charcoal and attended to like grumpy kittens, hot, unpredictable, and prone to sulking if you poked them. Now, there's a very sleepy little poem from the 14th century that claims fire doth favour none but those nearest. And that, dear dreamer, absolutely checks out. Castles were structured in a most heat-unfriendly fashion. Wide stone halls, high ceilings, and windows that wouldn't know airtight if it hit them with a Norse gale meant that fireplaces, however large and roaring, were doomed to a small radius of impact. You were either right next to the fire, or you were considering what hands felt like before numbness set in. This led to a strategic hierarchy of warmth. Those closest to the monarch weren't just warm politically, they were physically toasty. The further down the social ladder you tumbled, the more you found yourself huddled near doorways, wrapped in whatever scrap of wool you could barter from the household linens, staring longingly at the nearest log as if you could will its heat in your general direction. But then there was always the royal bed. Ah, the medieval bed was not modest. It did not tuck neatly into corners or whisper compact contemporary living. No, the royal bed shouted, "I am here, and I am enormous." Four-posted, heavily curtained, and likely a small diocese of its own, the bed was the king's final fortress against the cold. Velvet drapes hung like theatrical stage curtains designed to block out both draft and descent. Inside, the mattress, stuffed generously with wool, feathers, or some God's blessed arrangement of both, offered a rare softness in this otherwise granite-themed lifestyle. And let's not forget the warming pan. A humble contraption. A brass or copper pan with glowing embers walked across the sheets like a sleepy snail by a servant, or, in rare moments of poetic romance, by a queen with cold toes and steady hands. The idea was to take the chill out of the bed before the monarch slipped in, not unlike preheating an oven, though ideally with less smoke and significantly fewer roast chickens. We must also spare a late-night thought for the bedfellow. No, not that kind. We're talking about a literal companion required for bodily heat, the medieval equivalent of a cuddle subscription service. It's said some kings invited favoured courtiers, brothers, or even priests to share the bed in deep winter. Platonic, practical, and very much dictated by how bad is it outside standards rather than anything scandalous. After all, even a king must sometimes admit that his dignity is less important than the temperature of his nose. And so, as the wind sighed around the battlements and the servants tiptoed past with steaming mugs of posset, a milky, spiced drink that whispered of sleep and festivity, the king bundled deeper into his blanket fortress, secure atop pillows and beneath drapery, a monarchical marshmallow waiting for dawn. But while the bedchamber drifted into silence, elsewhere in the castle, a quieter battle brewed. In the kitchens, where warmth, more delicious and intentional, was being stirred over glowing coals. If you ever took a wrong turn while exploring a medieval castle, and let's face it, with all those oddly angled spiral staircases and doors that seem to lead into solid stone, how could you not? You might find yourself in a rather curious corridor, damp, chilly, and lined with peculiar wooden slats or iron grates near the floor. It would seem unimportant at first glance, but my dear, you'd have just stumbled upon a marvel of medieval engineering. The humble, smoky, not at all central heating system, known to history as the Hipparchus's rather disappointing spiritual cousin, the Great Fireplace Flue Network. By the 12th and 13th centuries, castle architects figured out that one big roaring fireplace in the Great Hall wasn't quite enough to fend off the kind of cold that inspired monasteries to brew beer just to stay alive. So they got clever, very clever. They began building intricate systems of hidden wall flues and chimneys, allowing heat from large fireplaces to waft through rooms and castle floors like a sleepy dragon snoring underfoot. Of course, these flues didn't always work as intended. Sometimes, instead of gently warming the stones, they turned castles into giant smoky ovens. Imagine trying to sleep in your chamber and being suddenly woken by the smell of roast leg of something or someone. To solve this, lords had to hire what we'd now call thermal consultants, though they answered more to names like Geoffrey of Much Muckling and wore robes that smelt of soot and secrets. But wait, before we delve too deep into the intestines of castle heating, perhaps we should look at the true MVP. Stone. Yes, stone. Cold, hard, unyielding stone. And therein lies the problem. Castles weren't built to be warm. They were built to be impressive and invincible, much like the in-laws. But keeping all that glorious gloom from freezing your noble parts off required more than just prayers and a thick cloak. Enter the solar chamber. No, not powered by sunshine. The medieval solar was a private room, usually located on the upper floors, where the master and mistress of the house could escape the drafty ravages of public castle life. Think of it as the medieval version of a heated blanket fort. Intimate, dry, and graced with tapestries on the walls, not just for decoration, but for legitimate insulation. Tapestries, in fact, were the ancient world's answer to double glazing. Hung with elegance across walls, they weren't merely scenes of knights doing knightly things for aesthetic pleasure. They were thick, woolen, warmth-hoarding masterpieces, a high-status thrum of insulation, and occasionally mole-proofing. Then there were the essentials no self-respecting wintering aristocrat could do without: fur-lined robes, woolen tunics, sheepskin slippers, and possibly enough layers to make a modern hiker say, "I think that's overkill." It wasn't uncommon to sleep in everything you owned, plus borrow a servant's tunic for extra warmth. Medieval nobles, despite their titles, were not above accessorizing with peasant warmth. And speaking of accessories, one cannot ignore the influence of personal hand warmers, tiny furnaces for your fingers, crafted from brass or earthenware and filled with glowing coals. These chafing dishes, as they were sometimes called, not to be confused with what your brunch eggs sit on, were held, balanced, or placed at the feet under layers of skirts or gowns. Picture a group of nobles in full velvet regalia, all casually cradling what looked suspiciously like ornate portable barbecues. A fashion statement perhaps, but one that gently singed the hems. These little portable embers of joy worked their magic on more than just fingers. In bed, a pan full of glowing coals, called a brazier or a bed warmer, would be slipped between the sheets to toast them before the noble slid in. Hopefully, someone remembered to take it out. Otherwise, one could wake up considerably warmer than expected, and noticeably on fire. Still, even the wealthiest kings had to admit, sometimes stone was simply, coldly, unhelpful, which is why so many royal households migrated seasonally. You heard that right. Many medieval monarchs were essentially upscale snowbirds. They didn't just rule, they moved, swapping windswept castles in the north for manor houses further south, following the sun like a very well-dressed tortoise seeking a new log. And before you wonder whether peasants had it worse, they did. But their cottages, often built with lower ceilings and stuffed with straw insulation, were actually cozier than parts of royal keeps. Lesson: sometimes piles of thatch are better than fortified towers, but high above those peasant cottages and burnings, fingers and tapestried chambers, deep within the castle's walls, and high in those royal solar chambers, something else was stirring, something candlelit, velvety, and decidedly more aromatic than a brazier full of coals. It's time we step quietly into the perfume chambers of medieval bedchambers themselves, the sanctuaries of warmth, secrecy, and more than a few scandalous heating hacks. There comes a time in every medieval winter when even the most stoic of kings began to reconsider their life choices, usually right around the moment their rear touched an ice-cold wooden throne seat at dawn. By this midpoint in the long, grey lull of winter, the novelty of managing a kingdom was often replaced by more pressing concerns like, why are my feet colder than the enemy's heart? And, have we tried setting the furniture on fire just a little bit? And so, in the quiet heart of wintry castles, as icicles dangled smugly from stone arches and frost crept along stained glass like it was trying to sneak in for a royal audience, medieval royalty turned to the last remaining front line of defense against hypothermia: people. More specifically, other people's body heat. It was a time when proximity was power, and not just political. Imagine the royal bedchamber, large, echoing, possibly haunted by the ghost of an ancestor who died of a chill. Tapestries fluttered as if nervous. Though kings had their own chambers, they were rarely alone, not if they wanted to still be able to feel their noses in the morning. Enter the warming pan and the royal bedfellow. Now, let's be perfectly clear. Being a royal bedfellow did not necessarily involve scandal, or even a warm embrace. No, these were close, often platonic, sometimes grumbly arrangements for purely thermal benefit. A king might call upon a servant to lie beside him all night, like a very obedient space heater with legs. Body heat was currency, and laying next to the monarch became an actual job. Warming pans, meanwhile, were little brass or copper contraptions filled with glowing embers, placed under the bed covers in a desperate attempt to transform the bedding from sheet of icy doom to mildly survivable. Of course, as with any fire-based solution in a room filled with flammable tapestries and the blistering uncertainty of medieval infrastructure, warming pans had a tendency to go from comforting warmth to fire hazard in 17 seconds flat. Still, they were preferred to freezing, just slightly. Then there were the royal layers. No, not advisors or courtiers, though those could make a person hot under the collar too, but layers of insulation. A medieval king in winter often resembled an onion stuffed inside a roast goose. Nightshirts, undershirts, overshirts, thick woolen hose, perhaps an ermine-lined robe just for a touch of flair, because even freezing to death should be fashionable. And naturally, what would monarchy be without the truest of luxuries? Having your bed sufficiently preheated by someone else before you even arrive. Servants would sometimes be ordered to lie in the royal bed beforehand, warming it with their own weary bodies, while the king finished dinner or held court. You may never have wished to be a medieval servant before, but now you definitely still don't. Speaking of dinner, meals in this era were another sly source of heat. The Great Hall, usually the warmest room in the castle thanks to its enormous hearth and concentration of bodies, was not just a place for merriment. It was the castle's version of winter sunbathing. People lingered, loitered, loomed suspiciously near the fire, whatever it took. And yet, even with all these efforts, the bedfellows, the warming pans, the fashion-forward layering, and the culinary loitering, there was still one final secret weapon wielded by royalty when the cold crept too far: relocation. Yes, kings sometimes simply packed up their royal baggage, literal and emotional, and hit the frozen road. They sought out milder climes within their own domains, south-facing keeps, hunting lodges blessed with slightly less wind exposure, or the homes of suspiciously well-heated nobles who might need a reminder of who their king was, and who'd be bunking with them until April. Winter, after all, did not last forever. But until the thaw came, comfort was pieced together stitch by stitch, ember by ember, servant by very chilly servant. And though the castles remained grand and the crown stayed golden, in those long frozen nights, kings were not so different from the weary shepherd or the bustling cook. Everyone wanted the same elusive marvel: warmth. And in the next flicker of insight, we might just peer into what was perhaps the coziest and most elite corner of all: the monarch's bed itself. Blankets, bolsters, and bedtime secrets await. As the frost crept in through arrow slits and centuries-old cracks, you might expect medieval kings to shiver in their royal boots, perhaps composing frost-bitten poetry about the despair of draughty corridors and the cruelty of stone walls. But while winter pressed its icy fingers against the panes of castle life, the kings, wrapped in layers of invention, privilege, and occasionally fur from a particularly fluffy ermine, had more than a few ways to escape becoming royal popsicles. Let's begin, as all warm stories should, in the privy. Yes, the royal privy. Strange as it may sound, the medieval toilet was was sometimes the warmest room in the castle. Not for sentimental reasons, mind you, but because many castles built their privies atop vertical shafts that led straight to the moat or a pit below. These shafts, being hollow, allowed warm air from the lower levels or the not-so-pleasant fumes from the composting below to waft upwards. It's a peculiar cocktail of warmth and odour, but warmth is warmth when your options are mildly disgusting or frozen fingertips. Of course, no king worth his crown wanted to spend all day sitting above the moat, however organic the heating method. So, they called upon medieval ingenuity and a little thing called the braziers. Simple metal pans filled with hot coals. Braziers were placed throughout the castle in a valiant attempt to combat the chill. These glowing bowls were not without risk. Quite a few tapestries gave their lives in fiery sacrifice, but the warmth they offered was worth a singed curtain or two, or 12. Now you'd think a vast, high-ceiling stone great hall would be the last place you'd want to spend time in winter, and you'd be right. But kings used something wonderful and practical. Tapestries, gigantic wall hangings, woven with wool and sometimes even silk, depicting everything from hunting scenes to flamboyant unicorns prancing through meadows that almost certainly didn't exist. These tapestries were insulation with artistic ambition. Like grand medieval quilts tacked to walls, they kept some of the cold out and some of the king's body heat in. But let us not forget the most indulgent and magnificent heating device of all, the four-poster bed with drapes. More than just an Instagram-worthy sleep pod, this was the medieval monarch's fortress within a fortress. Heavy woolen or velvet drapes could be drawn shut entirely, transforming the bed into a tiny room, a personal cocoon of fabric. Inside, feather mattresses stacked high and furs piled even higher transformed a cold chamber into a dreamy little nest. It was a space to thaw toes, whisper secrets, or, if you were Henry the scheme about your next wife. Some castles went even further down the warm path, quite literally. Subterranean passages were used to channel heat between floors, an early sort of central heating. Castles in cold regions, like those in Scotland or Northern Europe, might have underfloor heating systems inspired by Roman hypercourse. Of course, this was less common than you might imagine. Heating a stone floor from below in medieval times was roughly as practical as installing Wi-Fi in a loaf of bread. Resourceful? Yes. Commonplace? Not even a little. Now, for our culinary moment. The medieval kitchen wasn't just for stuffing pies with questionable ingredients. It was a furnace, a refuge, an unintentional heater of the castle's heart. Kitchens blazed nearly round the clock, and clever kings often had their private chambers built above or near the kitchen, banking on the eternal truth. The quickest way to a warm room is a good roast goose below. Warmth would rise upward, and while it wouldn't make the chambers balmy, it did offer just a kiss of coziness. Let us also praise the cloaks. Thick woolen cloaks, often lined with fur and clasped at the neck with brooches so ornate they could double as weaponry. Kings wore them indoors, outdoors, sideways, any direction the wind blew. Layers were the key. This was the era before central heating and hoodies, remember. A royal's wardrobe was less about fashion and more about survival. And finally, because no detail is too minor when your breath freezes before it touches the floor, they embraced companionship. Dogs, cats, and occasionally other humans. Yes, even royalty practiced the fine art of snuggling. A faithful hound curled at the foot of the bed could provide more warmth than a brazier, and didn't require coal. So picture it. A king wrapped in layers upon layers of cloth and fur, nestled into a four-poster fortress under woolen drapes, a small brazier glowing like a captive sun nearby, the crackling of the distant hearth mixing with the muted howl of wind through ancient stone. Outside, icicles droop like glass daggers. Inside, the king snores gently, a snuggled pup occasionally twitching its paw. But while the royal bed was warm and sleep-inducing, what of the servants who kept the fires burning, the braziers stoked, and the tapestries properly hung? Their tale is worth a dream or two of its own. As twilight fell over the frost-fringed valleys of medieval Europe, the castle walls groaned quietly beneath the weight of winter. Stone, as dignified as it was in resisting arrows and time, made for an insufferable companion in the cold. And yet, inside those draughty grey monoliths, noble folk were expected to live, rule, and host the occasional banquet, without turning icicle blue. This, dear listener, called for cunning. Enter the solarium. No, not quite the kind you'd find at a modern spa. Humming and scented suspiciously like a coconut orchard. This was the medieval solarium, a rare and illustrious chamber built to catch and hoard sunlight like a miser with gold coins. These rooms, blessed with larger windows than most castle chambers dared allow, faced the southern sun and filled, when nature cooperated, with a tepid but much adored warmth. On a good day, sitting in the solarium was like politely borrowing heat from the heavens. On a bad day, it was, well, sitting in a stone refrigerator with slightly more natural light. For more immediate toasty relief, people turned to their great and mysterious ally, the fire. But of course, any old peasant could build a fire. Kings needed better. Enter the royal fireplace, a titanic mouth of flame-related ambition. These ornate hearths blaze so heartily that one could roast an alliance treaty next to it and still warm their toes. Fireplaces like these became the nucleus of noble life, especially in the Great Hall, which, by design, was basically a coal canyon that happened to include a roof. But flames alone weren't enough. Not in January, not with granite on every side. So came the tapestries, those woven wonders that served both as art and insulation. Draped across stone walls like tremendously heavy sweaters, tapestries kept out the bitter kiss of wind, while also depicting fanciful scenes of heroic battle, celestial creatures, or possibly just a horse that looked vaguely like Uncle Harold. They were often made of wool or linen and stitched into them a secret weapon. Layers. Not unlike onions, castles were layered for warmth. Beneath the tapestries might be wooden paneling. Beneath that, perhaps rush matting or oak planks plastered against the stone. These tricks added insulation in places where heating was otherwise wishful thinking. Of course, heat rises, and so did the royal family, quite literally. While peasants huddled near the ground, aristocrats often lodged on upper floors, where escaping warmth pulled like a lazy cat. The king's solar, his private quarters, perched atop the castle like a smug seagull, catching all the thermal advantage. Bedding was its own fortress of warmth. The royal bed was no humble frame. It was a command center of coziness. Picture this: thick canopies overhead, heavy curtains drawn on all sides to trap body heat within. Inside, layer after layer of blankets, fur, wool, and possibly unicorn if you believe the sellers in certain medieval markets, plus warming pans slipped between sheets to fend off the initial chill. These pans, filled with glowing coals and swung gently across the bed, were the medieval way of saying, "I understand luxury, and I fear frostbite, and if fire and fabric fail to bring comfort, then we enter the political domain of fur." You see, wearing the right furs wasn't just about staying warm. It was a statement. Mink whispered of dignity. Ermine practically yelled monarch. The more exotic your pelts, the toastier your body, and the more envious your fellow lords. When someone strolled into a council chamber swaddled in lynx, even their enemies had to admit they looked both dangerous and deeply snug. Of course, there were always layers beneath layers. Linen undergarments, woolen tunics, fur-lined cloaks, all choreographed into a winter fashion symphony. By the time a king was dressed for a winter's walk, he resembled a well-fed bear in a crown. Yet somehow, dignity endured. Even feasts, the very heart of medieval merrymaking, were warmed from the outside in. With fires crackling, bodies pressed together, and mugs of spiced mead passed around like warm handshakes, the great hall was temporarily transformed into a human furnace. Merriment, after all, generates its own kind of warmth. And so, through ingenuity, a fair bit of layering, and just a sprinkle of medieval bravado, our regal ancestors braved each frosted season atop their stony thrones. But while kings had their hearths and high towers, you might be wondering, how did their guards fare when stationed overnight on icy ramparts? Now there's a frosty story worth unfolding, somewhere between a damp hearth and a frosted goblet of mulled wine. A medieval king might very well wonder if the entire notion of royalty was worth the persistent sensation of frozen knees. Throne or no throne, the biting cold did not discriminate. Though kings had privilege, power, gold-threaded cloaks, and the ability to order a 4-course banquet at dusk, they still had to contend with a simple, unglamorous truth. Stone castles were drafty, cold, and utterly unbothered by their royal tenants. By the 15th century, castle architects had admittedly experimented with the idea of comfort. Spiral staircases, elaborate archways, defensive murder holes, all very chic of course, but insulation, that was still an aspiration rather than a reality. A castle wall, for all its glory and arrows sabotaging thickness, chilled like a slab of beef left outdoors all December. So how did a king keep his royal toes from turning blue? Enter the grand tradition of excessive carpeting. Rush-covered floors, which were once considered perfectly acceptable home decor and technically food composting sites, began making way for woven wall hangings and tapestries thick enough to double as dinner blankets. These tapestries weren't merely hung to impress visiting nobles with scenes of hunt and battle. No, they were insulation heroes with embroidered credentials. A castle hall cloaked in tapestries became, well, tolerably warmish. By medieval standards, that is. Meanwhile, kings surrounded themselves with a huddle of humans cleverly disguised as courtiers. Every royal assembly, meeting, or inquisitorial chat about grain taxes included a dozen or more bodies, all emitting heat, breathing, and generally helping raise the temperature of the room. One could easily say that the medieval monarchy invented the original concept of central heating by centralizing actual humans into smallish rooms. And then, of course, there were the fireplaces, the mighty hearths, often large enough to roast an entire boar or 2 Christmas geese and still have space left over for a sleepy guard. But here's the catch. Most of the smoky residue didn't exactly go up a nicely designed flue. Chimneys, as we now know them, didn't become widely common until later in the medieval period. Before that, smoke simply did what it wanted. Meandered lazily across the ceiling, gave the tapestries a new shade of grey, and eventually found its way out through a hole in the roof. This charming method also doubled as a rather effective, if involuntary, form of facial steaming. Kings learned to navigate this daily sauna of wood smoke and erratic warmth not with disdain, but with fur. Luxurious, abundant, sometimes questionably sourced fur. Squirrel fur, believe it or not, was quite fashionable. The undercoat of the Eurasian red squirrel, known as vair, became the upmarket trim for royal garments. And not just one squirrel, mind you, hundreds, sewn together into coats so regal and so fluffy they could smother both drafts and small ambitions. Vair-lined robes were often matched with ermine accents, and if something wasn't already furry, you can be sure someone was paid to fur it up promptly. Sleeping arrangements helped too. Kings often slept in curtained beds, majestic four-posters, with thick drapery enclosing them like royal cocoons. This wasn't just for the aesthetic drama, although medieval kings rarely said no to aesthetic drama, but for warmth. Inside these velvet-wrapped sleeping pods, it could actually be bearable, even snug, as long as no one opened a window or, say, breathed too hard near the drapes. Food played its role too. Warming spices, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, became cornerstones of royal feasting. A belly full of slow roasted meat, chased by spicy wine, does wonders for those nagging, icy fingers and toes. Did kings overdo it? Absolutely. But who among us could resist a hot pie and mulled wine in a freezing stone hall? And finally, let us not forget the humble hot brick. Yes, bricks heated beside a fire and wrapped in cloth were one of medieval life's quietest triumphs. Carried to the royal bed like precious treasure, they served as pre-electric heating pads. Naturally, it was not the king who carried the brick. That task was reserved for a page, perhaps also repeatedly reminded never to drop it on His Majesty's foot. So while castles may have shivered down to their very foundations in winter, a king had his circle of warmth. Tapestries thick enough to stop a sneeze, courtiers emitting a slow simmer of body heat, fireplaces roaring with more smoke than flame, and beds cloaked like theatre stages after final curtain. And yet, for all this royal coziness, the truly revolutionary shift in castle heating was still waiting in the wings, quietly simmering in the kitchens, beneath bubbling pots, where cooks and servants prepared something so simple, yet so revolutionary, it would come to warm kings and peasants alike, one simmering ladle at a time. In the deepest days of winter, when the frost engraved intricate signatures across arrow-slit windows and icicles did choreography along every parapet, the medieval nobleman faced a peculiar predicament: get out of bed and freeze, or remain under a mound of furs and risk wasting away from sheer laziness. Many opted for the second, but the truly clever had a third strategy: summon a page boy with hot bricks wrapped in linen. Ah yes, the medieval hot water bottle, except with less water and more fire hazard. For most European monarchs, comfort was always a matter of combining luxury with a dash of human suffering. Consider the warming pan, a shallow metal tray filled with glowing embers, slid under bedsheets by a servant who either had gentle hands or an astonishing tolerance for burns. Used hastily and never left unattended, the pan added a kiss of warmth to frigid bedding, provided the bed didn't become an enthusiastic bonfire. Now, if you were a king, you didn't just rely on such modest comforts. No, your status demanded heat with a touch of ceremony. And so came the footboys with their brass braziers, small metal stoves carried from chamber to chamber, trailing smoky tendrils and occasionally singeing the hems of expensive tapestries. Royal toes were held near these tiny fire bins like sacred relics, and if your royal feet turned pink instead of purple, it was considered a smashing success. The real hero of these bitter months, however, wasn't some coal-carrying servant or a fire pan whisperer. It was the canopy bed. More than a sleep station, it was a microclimate on stilts. Heavy drapes hung like rain clouds, trapping human heat and exhale snores in equal measure. Within its feudal fabric tent, a monarch could doze off in a womb-like warmth, cozy, private, and only slightly suspicious smelling. To those outside, the stifled air seemed unbearable, but to the king inside, it was paradise warmed by breath, body heat, and the occasional large dog curled dangerously across one foot. And yes, dogs. Royal pups weren't just for hunting rabbits or posing in tapestries. During the medieval cold season, they were reliable, fluffy furnaces. Spaniels, greyhounds, and even particularly well-trained hounds were allowed to snooze beside kings and queens. The warmth of a canine companion was non-negotiable. There's a tale, perhaps more fanciful than factual, of a 14th century French king who refused to travel without at least 3 small dogs and a portable fur-lined shed. One had to wonder who was reigning over whom at that point. Of course, no mention of medieval indoor warmth avoidance is complete without discussing hearths. Grand fireplaces roared like dragons in great halls, consuming logs the size of peasant cottages. In royal quarters, fires were more refined but no less ravenous. Built of carefully stacked timber, often selected for its aroma. Imagine Queen Eleanor sniffing disdainfully and saying, "No, Reginald, I said cedar, not ash. Honestly, must I do everything?" Tapestries, too, played their silent part. These weren't just wall jewelry for nobility. They were unashamed insulation. Layered fabric walls hand-embroidered with scenes of conquest or occasional unicorns, depending on one's mood. Hung along stone walls, they blocked drafts and preserved warmth, provided the mice didn't chew through them first, which they did, frequently. And yet, even with hearths blazing and dogs snoring at one's feet, a royal winter was not all gingerbread and chestnuts. Drafts crept like spies beneath doors, condensation turned goblets into cold traps, and one could never sit on a stone bench without first testing it with the sacrificial squires behind. Still, there was something charming about it all. The smoky scents, the woolen layers, the muffled laughter of courtiers sipping warm mead near a glowing hearth. Outside, the wind howled through the turrets like a lovesick ghost. But inside, among firelight and fur, time slipped like honey into sleep. And somewhere in the corner, a servant yawned, cradling another batch of glowing coals meant for cold toes and royal bottoms. Drowsily now, we begin to follow the flicker of that fire into another chamber, one where bathwater steamed against the frost. There is perhaps no greater betrayal in life than the icy stone bench of a castle privy on a bitter January morning. Medieval winter had no mercy, even for those born with crowns. You see, heat in a castle was a stubborn guest. It refused to stay put. It liked to rise up, escape through the roof, and vanish like a jester avoiding responsibility. And so, our medieval monarchs, despite commanding armies and bending the wills of lords, remained powerless against the relentless march of winter drafts. But then, there were the tapestries. Yes, the grand woven murals that dazzle museum goers today once served a much humbler, albeit crucial purpose. They were the medieval version of insulation foam. Miles of woven wool lined with dreams, dragons, and family trees hung from stone walls to keep King Henry's royal toes from turning into courtly icicles. One particularly creative monarch of the 14th century, Charlemagne's great-great dreaming cousin, commissioned so many tapestries of his own face that entering his great hall felt like walking into the world's first narcissistic duvet. but his castle was undeniably warmer for it, and perhaps that was worth enduring 37 pairs of woven eyeballs staring at you through dinner. And then, of course, there was the canopy bed. Now, pause and imagine it. A majestic wooden frame, thick velvet drapes trailing to the floor, an inner sanctum of warmth, privacy, and mild snoring. The canopy bed was no mere statement piece. It was an ingenious, swaddled fortress within a drafty one. When the fires died down, the lofty stone hearth still whispering of yesterday's embers, the heavy curtains of the royal bed were drawn not for drama, but for survival. Underneath, the lord or lady tucked into a mountain of feather-stuffed mattresses and woolen layers, like a flaky pastry with a crown on top. Body heat became precious currency and was carefully hoarded under furs, cloaks, or, if particularly fortunate, beneath the gentle warmth of a small dog who had absolutely no notion of rank or etiquette. Speaking of dogs, their role in medieval warming strategies should not be underestimated. Small breeds, especially those of the lap and foot warming persuasion, were prized companions. Mary, Queen of Scots, was said to carry her lapdog everywhere, especially important in drafty Scottish palaces where whiskey was not yet central heating. If your dog didn't like you, or worse, belonged to someone else, you could always hire a human. Enter the bed warmer. These were not people one invited to tea, necessarily, but they had a straightforward and utterly vital job, taking a brass or copper pan filled with hot coals and slowly sliding it between the sheets before bedtime. This avoided the toe-numbing terror of icy linens and, on more tragic occasions, ensured your mattress didn't go up in a merry blaze. Skilled bed warmers had a gentle hand and a firm understanding of physics. The less skilled, well, they contributed to the great tradition of castle scorch marks and the occasional suspicious fire. And yet for all the fires, braziers, wall-hung woolen art, and toasty spaniels, the greatest source of warmth in medieval castles was something no money could buy: people. Castles were bustling with life. Servants stoking fires, cooks simmering stews so rich you could warm your hands over them, guards pacing, ladies spinning, lords arguing about hunting rights, and scribes furiously copying out royal decrees that nobody would get around to reading for weeks. All of them, breathing, moving, generating an ambient human heat that softened the bite of cold stone. The great hall, filled with bodies during feasts, could become positively tropical compared to its frostbitten corridors. And so, the medieval king stayed warm with the help of three things: ingenuity, indulgence, and others. For heat, like power, was more bearable when shared. And somewhere, as snowflakes drifted like shy courtiers through the grey dawn sky, the king might rise, groaning from under 20 pounds of blanket, shuffle to the fire, poke it once indignantly with a stick, and proclaim, "A bit nippy, isn't it?" "Yes, Your Majesty. But never fear. Breakfast fires crackle in the kitchens, and the wine is being slightly warmed today, just to take the edge off. Now that our monarch is up and yawning, perhaps it's time we drift closer to the heart of castle warmth, the bustling kitchens, because where there's stew, there's steam, and, quite possibly, socks drying by the hearth." There was something peculiar about medieval bedchambers, not just their colossal beds that could fit a football team if football existed, but rather the way they became private sanctuaries against the creeping bite of winter. When you lived in a castle whose walls were thick enough to host an archery tournament on top, heating was less about centrally managed thermostats and more about strategic curtain placement and an alarming dependency on small fireplaces and enormous bed canopies. Let's begin with the canopy bed, a majestic piece of furniture so elaborate and encased it would make a Victorian dollhouse look minimalist. Draped in rich tapestries and heavy velvet curtains, these beds didn't just scream royalty, they also muttered draft protection. When the fire died down in the hearth and the cold griffins of February howled outside, nobles would draw their bed curtains shut, essentially converting their sleeping space into a plush tent of warmth. It was early medieval bed tech, pocket-sized climate pockets, if you will. Speaking of fires, a medieval castle's fireplace was, at best, suggestive of warmth. Most great chambers might have a single sizable hearth, complete with cavity, iron fire dogs, and a continuously unimpressed page assigned to stoke it. But in royal bedchambers, the fire would be modest, certainly not enough to roast a wild boar, but perhaps enough to warm one's toes if you stood very still and very close for an hour. Of course, when the wind pierced even the best stonework, because no matter what they tell you, stone is nature's finest radiator of coldness. Medieval minds reached for a curious invention known as the bed warmer. Now, before you envision a medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle with swirly embroidery and Latin quotes, imagine instead a long-handled metal pan filled with glowing coals, expertly shuffled between the linen sheets moments before bedtime. Yes, nothing screams romance and relaxation like preheating your bed with a small, fire-prone container of embers. The trick, of course, was to warm the bed, not light it on fire, a nuance some learned the hard way. But did royalty allow themselves to shiver like commoners? Not a chance. Their solution: pile on layers like a textile onion. Medieval monarchs went to bed clad in voluminous nightshirts, often of wool or linen. Against the rules of contemporary comfort, yes, but highly effective. On particularly bitter nights, with poachers freezing in the woods and jesters refusing to joke, some nobles even wore fur nightcaps to bed, as if cosplaying a very serious squirrel. The head loses a lot of heat after all, so cover it with dignity. Or with ermine-trimmed hats, shaped like collapsed pastries. As if that weren't enough, the truly frost-averse took companionship very seriously. Some beds weren't occupied by a single sleepy sovereign, but instead shared with a spouse, a pug, a beloved greyhound, a favoured courtier, and perhaps even a priest who just wandered in to discuss prayers, all huddled for warmth, like noble penguins braving an ice age. It was cosy, yes, and thoroughly nosy. Let us not overlook the ultimate heat source of a medieval winter's night: medieval pets. Not quite the pause you wish for kind these days. We're talking about lapdogs bred explicitly for nobility's chilly laps. Dogs like the Bichon, the Maltese, and the delightfully named Comforters would snuggle beneath the sheets, serving as living hot water bottles, although with more shedding, and the occasional bark-induced startle. When all else failed, the king might summon what was affectionately known as a fire screen. Not a screen made of fire, but a portable wooden partition placed between the monarch and the fireplace, designed to reflect the heat back toward him, while hopefully not directing the smoke straight into his crown. The screen often had embroidered panels depicting allegories or hunting scenes, giving you something warm-hearted to look at as your face slowly thawed on one side. Yes, staying warm in a medieval castle was not a passive activity. It was an event, a design challenge, a collaborative performance of layering, combustion, snuggling, and curtain-based engineering. Every night was an adventure. You weren't just going to bed. You were declaring war on frost with a wool-lined sword and a canopy of hope. And as the cold continued to haunt the corridors like a ghost with poor time management, the people of the castle found ever more peculiar ways to stay cozy, including a most curious ritual involving footmen, warm ale, and socks so thick they had their own political opinions. But that, as any sleepy king would agree, is a tale best whispered in the next breeze-drifted hour, as twilight sighs across the frost-laced towers of medieval Europe. We find ourselves drifting into yet another peculiar corner of cold castle conundrums, the royal tradition of layering, but not just clothing. No, we mean layering people. There is, quite delightfully, an old medieval saying that goes something like, "Where there's warmth, there's someone snoring next to you." If that doesn't exist, it should have, because kings, queens, and assorted lords of questionable hygiene were no strangers to turning bedtime into a group activity. The concept of alone time in a royal bedchamber was as frosty as the stone walls themselves. Despite the massive four-poster beds draped in velvet and heavy curtains, the true secret to their warmth was a technique we'd recognize today as human insulation. Royals often slept shoulder to shoulder with their most loyal retainers, advisors, or anyone else who smelled vaguely clean. Not entirely clean, just vaguely. This wasn't out of affection, mind you. It was strategy. You see, physics doesn't care about your crown. Stone walls, even those thick enough to withstand a siege, conduct bodily misery with breathtaking efficiency. A solitary monarch in a royal bed might wake up frosted like a meat pie. Add a few warm bodies, though, and suddenly your queen's boudoir becomes a toasty social sauna. Of course, this royal pile-up often included more than just people. Enter the bed warmer, a term that, we regret to inform you, was often exactly what it sounded like. Sometimes this meant a servant entrusted with heating the monarch's bed before they got in. Sometimes it meant a favoured courtier, strategically invited for both warmth and flattery. And let's not ignore the canine contribution. Lapdogs weren't just accessories, they were sleep-time furnaces with tails. There are tales, often whispered around medieval hearths by gossipy chambermaids, that speak of King Charles VI of France, a man whose anxieties left him so cold and paranoid that he slept with woolen wraps and multiple bodyguards under the bed curtains. Whether they maintained those personal boundaries or not, we shall let your imagination, or dreams, decide. And then there were the bed curtains themselves. Oh, how we underestimate them in modern times. Heavy enough to clock a person unconscious if improperly hung, these thick drapes served as early insulation, keeping heat in and drafts out. When pulled tightly around the frame of the bed, they transformed the royal sleeping space into a miniature sauna of breath-warmed air, dog farts, and ambition. But even that required layering. Furs on the mattress, furs on top, furs underneath, and often the occasional furred courtier, if one was feeling particularly frostbitten and lonely. The catch? Those layers had to be peeled away with military strategy if one needed to relieve themselves at night. Which brings us gently to the subject of chamber pots, delightfully named but horrifyingly close companions to the medieval bed. You see, getting out of a warm bed, past snoozing diplomats and winter terriers, to find an ice-cold corridor lavatory. Unthinkable. Instead, a few royal tinkles conveniently shared the same velvet-draped square footage. Just imagine the smell of victory. Interestingly, some castles even had warming rooms near the sleeping quarters, a place known as the calefactory in monastic settings, or that blessed room where I don't freeze in the common tongue. These small chambers were heated by fire and sometimes used to toast oneself before braving bed or warm sheets in preparation. Truly, nothing says "good night, your grace" like freshly smouldering linens. And while kings drowsed off in beds full of courtiers, canines, and carefully arranged indignities, the fire in the hearth sputtered low, an orange glow breathing life into arched ceilings, and the occasional tapestry depicting St. George looking mildly inconvenienced. So the next time you're curled under a freshly fluffed duvet, remember, warmth was once a group project, a noble tangle of limbs, fur, fire, and faithful flatulence. And speaking of tangled arrangements, our journey continues with a peculiar practice involving medieval foot coverings, and why a king's toes were sometimes the warmest and best dressed part of him. The medieval royal bedchamber was not merely a place to sleep. It was a slow-cooked architectural casserole of necessity and delusion. By all accounts, it was the warmest room in the castle, which is a bit like saying the coziest iceberg is the one with a fleece blanket draped over it. In fact, the medieval king's bedroom was a complex affair of hangings, hearths, and human proximity. Let us then tiptoe past the roaring tapestries, avoid the ever-hungry cats circling near the rushes, and find the royal chamber where warmth was a full-time staff position. First, the bed. A king's bed was less a piece of furniture and more a wooden fortress within a stone fortress. These weren't the dainty four-posters you see in period dramas, but massive oak-frame beasts you could lose a court jester under, draped in thick wool, sometimes velvet, and ringed with heavy curtains that could be drawn shut like a small theatre. The royal bed was its own microclimate. Once inside, with furs piled, limbs layered, and possibly a noble spaniel tucked near the feet, it was warm enough that a medieval monarch might, for a fleeting second, forget the frostbitten corridors just beyond. Unfortunately, one rarely ruled a kingdom from under the covers, and that's where a clever battalion of warming strategies came into play. Let us examine perhaps the most iconic of coal-combating instruments, the humble bed warmer. This was a pan with a long handle filled with glowing coals and slid between the sheets before sleep. It sounds splendid, until you realize how often beds caught fire. A toasty rear could turn into a scorched inheritance if the servant nodded off mid-warming. One chronicler, not naming any names but full of schadenfreude, remarked on a noble who once woke to find his mattress afire and his dignity quite undone. So the procedure was later performed with more caution, and often by the footman with the steadiest hands and least flammable beard. Of course, royalty didn't just sit around waiting for warm air to happen. There were fires, yes, enormous hearths, often ornately carved, where logs the size of bishops were blazed daily. But even their mighty glow could not fully counter the eternal draftiness of castle walls, which were less insulated stone and more giant medieval cheese grater. Thus, enter the tapestries. Draped not only for decoration but as insulation, these grand woven murals kept both chill and political ambiguity at bay. A finely hung tapestry could trap heat against a wall and also tell a compelling story, like Sir Geoffrey slays an imaginary dragon, or the very modest triumph of the Earl of Sandwich. The finest ones, spun from wool and lined in silk, created a parlour of warmth that might even invite the occasional spontaneous poetry slam between counts. But the final linchpin of medieval bedroom heat, the true unsung hero, was people. Yes, the human factor. Because where there is a king, there is always a retinue. Sometimes the bedchamber itself included a smaller chamber attached, a sort of royal heat lobby. It might house a groom, an attendant, or 3 slightly confused foreign dignitaries who had been waiting since last Tuesday. Their exhalations, body heat, and tightly woven undergarments added an ambient warmth no hearth could ever generate. In some cases, the king's favourite servant, often a gentleman of the bedchamber, whose title sounds more luxurious than his duties, would be tasked with warming His Majesty's breeches under their own cloak, or even, legend has it, sliding beneath the covers first to take the chill away. Now that is job dedication, particularly when one considers the king might also request hot spiced wine, warmed slippers, a song, and possibly an explanation of last Thursday's taxes, all at once. As the fire crackles down to its embers and the heavy bed curtains are drawn shut for the night, the king, ensconced among furs, linen, and the sweet smell of beeswax candles, drifts into slumber. Outside, the frost continues to trace delicate fractals on the battlements, undeterred by tapestry, politics, or pan-warmed sheets. Tomorrow, we'll step away from these intimate interiors and tiptoe into the royal kitchens, where heat, steam, and scandal are served in equal portions. As the snow whispered down over the castle rooftops, and the icicles grew like stalactites made by a very chilly artist, life within the stone walls turned slower, thicker, more muffled, and nestled in the deepest bowels of the castle, keep was one of the medieval world's most underrated luxuries, the royal garderobe. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't the garderobe just a fancy medieval word for the privy? Why, yes. Yes, it is. But like all things noble and deeply drafty, it had more than one purpose. You see, in many castles, the garderobe wasn't just a restroom. Oh no, it doubled as a built-in heating system. Stay with me. These vertical shafts, essentially long, dignified poop chutes, ran down the length of castle walls, and as it happens, they made excellent thermal conductors. The waste heat, and other things, generated from these shafts would sometimes waft upward, making the garderobe tower one of the warmer corners of a castle. Now, was this intentional? Maybe not entirely. But did folks adapt? Absolutely. It's recorded in a few castle blueprints that the walls adjacent to the garderobe were where you'd find storage for linens and even cloaks, absorbing just a whisper of warmth carried on. Let's say, a zephyr of questionable origin. And here's the clincher. During especially frigid nights, servants would sometimes bring cloaks or bedding into the garderobe corridor for a touch of pre-warming before layering them over their royal employers. Imagine a butler returning with your duvet and explaining with great dignity that it had just spent 15 minutes hanging next to the medieval loo for optimal toastiness. Sleep tight. Despite the occasional fragrant undertones, this passive heating method became one of the subtler comforts of castle life. There are even murmurs in certain castle records, written in the very careful medieval handwriting that looks like a spider in formal wear, that some monarchs had garderobes outfitted with wooden seats lightly padded with fleece, for reasons both comfortable and, let's be honest, merciful in midwinter. But warmth in castles came from many unexpected places. Take the tapestries, giant embroidered wall hangings that not only shouted, "I'm wealthy and I conquered Flanders," but also served as insulation. They softened the stone walls and blocked drafts, giving each chamber the ambiance of a slightly extravagant cave. Many of these tapestries depicted epic scenes, battles won on Belgian fields, saints resisting temptations, or elaborate scenes of peacocks serving wine to nobles, which, while not historically likely, made for very cozy metaphors. They weren't just art, they were insulation with a plot, but even finer than the warmth of rising garderobe drafts or the protective embrace of woolen wall hangings was the simplest luxury of all. People. In royal households, warming oneself was often a group activity. Beds were large, fireplaces were communal, and huddling was practically policy. Some monarchs even slept with their most trusted attendants, or, in the case of France's King Louis XIV, quite a few. Louis, being as majestic as his monogrammed chamber pots, occasionally held a ritualized bedtime routine called the coucher, a royal tucking-in parade attended by nobles who watched their king be dressed for sleep by the most senior courtiers, a surprisingly effective way to generate both body heat and passive-aggressive court gossip. And so, within these chill stone halls, the act of staying warm became an elaborate dance of architecture, innovation, and social theatre, from wind-baffling corridors to strategic featherbeds, from the heat gently rising through unintended channels to the embrace of communal sleeping arrangements. Medieval castle life may have lacked thermostats, but it never lacked creativity. And yet, we cannot talk of castle warmth without considering the throbbing heart of every noble hall, large and luminous and crackling with cheer, the great hearth fire, the true centerpiece, the drama queen of all heating methods. But that, my dear groggy listener, deserves a chapter all its own. Now tuck in tighter and dream of fleece-draped garderobes and artful peacocks juggling goblets as the fire of sleepy history glows on, as the frosty wind whistled through arrow slits and the long hush of winter cloaked the land in silence. One question loomed unspoken in many a medieval soul. Who, in the name of St. Crispin's icicles, thought stone walls and no insulation were a good idea? But if you wandered through the noble halls of a 14th century castle on some particularly miserable February morning, numb fingers clutching at a too thin woolen cloak, cheeks the colour of winter apples, you might find that survival, at least for the upper crust, meant less braving the cold and more bribing it to go away with food. Allow me to explain. You see, long before central heating and Instagrammable hot cocoa, noblemen and their households relied heavily on kitchens, not just for roasted swans and suspiciously large pies, but as de facto warming stations. In stone fortresses where heat had the general ambition of a lazy cat, kitchens burned endlessly. Great ovens, wood-fired hearths, and stew pots bubbling like a wizard's cauldron radiated more heat than any fireplace in the king's sleeping chamber. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for castles to be designed with multiple kitchens, some tucked away just beneath or beside the great hall, so that the warmth might waft upward like invisible luxury. These ovens, enormous contraptions made of brick and determination, didn't just cook beef or boil ale. They turned entire adjoining corridors into modestly bathed sanctuaries of warmth. Kitchens, in a fashion, became makeshift sunrooms for the privileged, glowing orange in the morning gloom. And here's a story for you. In the court of King Edward III, long before thermodynamics had a PR department, there's record of a certain Lord Varlin of Kent, known less for military prowess and more for his innovative approach to personal heating. It is said he had a narrow passage constructed between his chambers and the kitchen below, solely so warm air could drift toward his ceiling and not be wasted on the scullery maids. Unfortunately, the plan worked too well. The moist heat from the soup pots made his chamber ceiling swell and drip, not unlike a medieval fondue gone rogue. And according to the court physician, Varlan developed a condition that left his eyebrows permanently arched, as the ceiling dripped directly on his face each morning for 6 weeks. Radioactive eyebrows aside, Varlan was onto something. Kitchens truly were the unsung heroes of castle warmth, not just for their fires, but also for the ceaseless bodies bustling within. Cooks, spit-turners, bread makers, sauciers, boys whose sole job was to kneel near the coals and poke the embers when no one was looking. Every pair of hands chipped away at the frost. Every roast and every loaf came with a little steam on the side. Now, if you're imagining kingly sort sitting down in the actual kitchen to cozy up with a bowl of broth, I'm afraid that won't work. Kitchens were deliciously warm, yes, but they also smelled like 12 kinds of fish, 3 cheeses past their prime, and something burnt beyond recognition. Royal noses preferred distance, so instead, nobles employed subtle, almost adorable tricks to bring the kitchen's warmth to them. Take warming trays, for example. These were portable metal containers, almost like medieval hot plates, that could be filled with coals and nestled beneath feet, inside tables, or in some daring cases, under upturned chairs. A risky game, that one. There are a few medieval manuscripts that show a nobleman with his robe smoking slightly, and a caption that translates roughly to, "Sir Ambrose learns the fatal flaw of sitting on fire." Beyond all this, the food itself became a kind of warm armor. Stews thick with lard, breads heavy with barley, and mulled wine spiced hotter than a court scandal. Each meal was a tiny heater in disguise. You didn't just dine to delight, you dined to defrost your soul. And during grand feasts, with the great hall aglow from torches and fireplaces and the clamour of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies packed tightly together, warmth bloomed wherever elbows jostled and goblets clinked. Communal body heat, laced with roast goose and gossip. It may not have been glamorous, but it was effective. Like medieval group hugs with fewer boundaries. Eventually, kings and their architects would experiment with advanced solutions, hypocore systems, chimney engineering, and, yes, that most curious invention of all, the royal hot water bottle. But that's a tale best whispered when the fire is low and the stars begin to yawn. Let's wander there next. By the time we arrive at the mid-14th century, keeping warm in a grand but glacial stone castle had become less of a desperate scramble and more of an art form. A frigid, smoky, and rather aromatic art form. Imagine a vast echoing hall where the windows were essentially polite holes in the wall. The wind knew no concept of personal space, and the only thing separating your royal frostiness from hypothermia was an increasingly brave fire and an astonishing number of woolly layers. One particularly curious warming solution came in the form of the chafing dish, not just a medieval cooking item, but also, for our sleep-deprived kings and queens, a portable radiant heat source. Picture a shallow metal bowl filled with embers hovered over by noble toes. Cozy? Certainly. Safe? Well, let's just say, many a noble tapestry met a dramatic, smoky end. There were few things more medieval than a soothing bedtime foot warming, occasionally followed by a small fire drill. And then there was the ever-charming medieval warming pan, a long-handled brass contraption filled with hot coals, slid between mattress and blanket like a fiery medieval hot water bottle. Theoretically, it was a delightful invention. Practically, sliding a metal pan full of burning embers into your straw mattress had a definite element of risk, especially for those in the restless sleeper category. One kick too many, and the king's mattress had transformed into a very toasty bonfire of royal proportions. Still, Some royal bedrooms bore witness to more advanced heating methods. Hypocaust systems, borrowed from the Romans and seldom brought back to fashion, were rare but revered. These ingenious systems ran hot air under raised floors, which was both cozy and suspiciously warm for a land so used to frostbite. Of course, it required a separate room for the fire, a dedicated stoker, and a whole team of servants to explain why your stone slippers had started to sizzle. In some parts of Europe, especially the colder corners, castles embraced the clay tile stove called kakelugn in Sweden, which is coincidentally also the sound someone makes when they sit on one too soon. These stoves were essentially glorified chimneys dressed in ceramic armor, their tiles trapping heat long after the fire was out. A thoughtfully placed one could keep a royal bum blissfully warm clear into the morning, or at least until the first goose fight in the courtyard. But in the great tradition of medieval problem solving, when all else failed, the royal court fell back on a tried, tested, and marginally snuggly solution: huddling. Bedchambers were communal affairs, especially in winter. Royalty, nobility, a few trusted servants, a favourite hound or three, and the occasional lute player too cold to find his way out, all cuddled under heaps of fur throws and woolen blankets in oversized beds that can best be described as single-room log cabins made entirely of linen. Body heat, people said, was nature's central heating, and truly, nothing quite says regal splendor like a king poking his toes under a bishop's thigh in the dead of night. And of course, there were always the tapestries. More than just medieval Instagram boards, a castle's wall hangings were an essential method of insulation. They covered the stone like elaborate embroidered blankets, keeping the chill out and the echoes down. While historians love to wax lyrical about the artistic merit and storytelling of these woven wonders, their true value, particularly to a half-frozen noble without socks, was that medieval sheep had very warm wool. Indeed, the medieval elite stopped at little to keep warm. Layered, huddled, fire-panned, and stove-hugged their way through many winters. Yet perhaps the most overlooked method of all was strategic flattery. Castle fireplaces, you see, were rarely large enough to warm more than a favoured few. To get close, a clever courtier had to offer charming enough conversation, or at least better gossip than the gong farmer. So the next time you find yourself wondering how our icily enthroned ancestors managed to sleep without modern heating, know that they did what humans always do in the face of inconvenience. They adapted, they innovated, and they wore 4 cloaks to bed. Now, as the embers dim and the last chambermaid tucks an extra blanket over the cranky duke with cold knees, let us quietly float to the final glimmers of warmth and wisdom that history has left in its quilted folds. By the time winter had fully wrapped its icy arms around the medieval castle, life had slowed to a kind of frosted hush, the sort of soundless stillness where you can almost hear the snow think, that muffled quiet where the world seems to exhale and forget to inhale again. Inside the stone walls, things were surprisingly warmish, not warm as in summery picnic under a tree, warm. More, my toes are falling asleep, but not from frostbite warm. You see, after entire centuries of numb fingers and failed fireplace attempts, medieval folks had gotten fairly clever at keeping their royal extremities from freezing off. The king, of course, fared the best. At the heart of his chamber roared a splendid hearth, one large enough to roast a deer, or possibly an unfortunate court jester, should the mood strike. Positioned strategically against the thickest interior wall, less drafty, it crackled like a contented cat, radiating what heat it could through the velvet-swathed room. The tapestries hanging all around weren't just there for decorative drama. Those huge embroidered draperies could trap what little warmth there was, like very slow-moving heat sponges. If they showed heroic knights battling dragons while keeping out the winter bite, well, good for everyone. The royal bed was a fortress unto itself, a canopied masterpiece of feather mattresses, woolen blankets, fur throws, and enough fabric to choke a tailor. Our sleepy sovereign could disappear beneath layers of sheep's ancestry, only his nose sticking out, pink as a plum in mid-December. And speaking of noses, enter the bed warmer. Ah, the bed warmer. A humble device, resembling a gleaming brass frying pan on a stick and filled with hot coals. It wasn't for cooking midnight bacon, unfortunately. One dreams. No, this little pan was gently raked over the sheets just before bedtime to preheat the royal slumber zone. A skilled servant could warm the entire bed without setting it or themselves on fire, which frankly remains impressive. And as for nightwear, the king did not sleep in a crown, despite persistent artistic rumours, but he did sport something rather fetching: the medieval nightcap. A long, droopy hat that looked like it had ambitions of being a scarf, but gave up halfway. This wasn't a fashion choice exactly. Heat escapes from the head, and with stone walls whispering icy lullabies all night, a snug woolly hat made all the difference. Some even had little chin ties, adding just a hint of vaguely Victorian astronaut to the royal bedtime look. Down in the kitchens, as ever, the warmest place in the entire castle, servants huddled near ovens and huge boiling cauldrons of savoury stews, the kind that warmed you from the inside out and then asked if you wanted seconds. Many castles had their kitchens separate from the main hall to prevent fires, but underground tunnels and insulated passageways meant servants could still scurry through the cold like well-trained warmth couriers. And keeping the pipes warm. No, there were no indoor plumbing systems whispering lullabies of central heating. Chamber pots handled certain affairs, and if you thought someone had to carry them downstairs, congratulations, you've just invented one of the lesser-known castle jobs, the gong farmer. A real title. The less said, the better. But despite the chill and the labour and the relentless whimper of wind through stone slits in every corridor, the winter castle possessed its own strange coziness. Stories by firelight. Allah warmed near the hearth. The shuffle of fur slippers down echoing passageways. The distant sound of boots crunching snow in the courtyard like someone walking on sugar cubes. There's something dreamlike about it, isn't there? The thought of candles flickering softly beside a fur-draped throne, of the king drifting to sleep beneath woolen layers, lulled by the low growl of logs settling in the fire. Outside, the snow falls in a hush, and inside, time curls up and dozes with you. So now, as our watch comes to a close, you may rest too. Imagine a good fire crackling, tapestries swaying gently like sails in a stone sea, and donkeys snoring beneath a hay roof somewhere in the sleepy village below. All is well, the castle is warm, and you, weary noble of the digital realm, may drift away. Sleep tight.